Hello, Bill Molyneux here with Bill's History and Wargame World, and we are en route to Fort Ligonier, October 14th, 2022, but beforehand we are stopping at the historic Fort Bedford Museum in Bedford, Pennsylvania. Let's go take a look. Well, lucky for me, the museum is open. Here we have the entrance to the fort. Been here a few times. They've actually sold my games in the past. Admission for adults is 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And it's we do some video of the exterior too, but we'll go on and go in and see what's happening. Well, I'm lucky to be here in the museum with Jim, and he's going to tell me a little bit about Fort Bedford.
Okay, and this is a summary. I will skip over the details, and it still takes about 15 minutes to cover my presentation. So what I'm going to do, and I like to use this map.
All right.
What I'm going to do is explain why they ended up building a fort here in Bedford and how that was connected with all the forts east and west here in Pennsylvania. The fort was built during the French and Indian War, and that was a war that lasted from 1754 to 1763. And it was fought over who owns this part of Pennsylvania. That's where this war started. The English had control of Pennsylvania to the top of the Allegheny Mountains. And this land in the late 1740s, 1750s, this was largely unsettled. There were some Indian towns here. There were a few English traders there, but it was still actually unclaimed. The English assumed that this land belonged to them. And what happened was that in early 1750s, the French come down from Canada. They build a fort on Lake Erie, Presque Isle, build a couple little forts along the Allegheny, and they come down to where Pittsburgh sits today, and they put up a big fort there and named it Fort Duquesne. And whoever controls that spot controls all this part of Pennsylvania. Well, once the French had Fort Duquesne up, they told these English traders, John Fraser and the others, get out. They said, this is French land. And if they didn't get out, they burned them out. And so the French was making claim to land that the English always assumed was theirs. Now, as you might expect, the English are not going to settle for that once the French move in and claim that territory, and they had a fort there, troops there to enforce their ownership. Well, twice the English tried to drive the French out, and both of those times were big disasters for the English. The first time, I'm telling you, this is just a summary. The first time George Washington was sent into Fort Cumberland, and he ended up with about 400 men. And he was supposed to march up into western Pennsylvania, establish himself, and start to cut a wagon road toward Fort Duquesne. Well, he gets up into western Pennsylvania. He discovers...
Excuse me, Jim. Now, what part, since my viewers might ask, what is a local town that exists there nowadays?
Well, this is a place called the Meadows.
Okay.
And was a kind of an open area, and it was a good place to make an encampment and a good place to start. So the French, of course, learned that Washington's army was encamped there, and he was in their territory. So they sent a group of diplomats, about 30, to go and inform him that he's in French territory and he has to leave. So they began their trip toward the meadows, and Washington discovers where they're camping. And so he goes out and attacks them, kills 9 of them, captures the rest, and then he discovers this wasn't an army coming to attack him with 30 men. He realizes he made a big mistake. So he figures he's probably going to be attacked. So he throws up a little fort here, a circular fort. When I say little, it was about a third the size of this room. I have a picture of it. Did you want to see that? It's been rebuilt. Washington named it Fort Necessity.
All right, we got the picture.
This was the fort that Washington threw up in the meadow, and it wasn't much of a fort. It wasn't very big. It was about maybe 50, 60 feet in diameter. And once he put it up, he dug a trench around the outside also for defense. And he figures because he had attacked the diplomats that were coming to inform him he was on French lands, he knows he's probably going to be attacked. Well, he throws his little fort up. He names it Fort Necessity. It's been reconstructed on the site. It's now a federal site. And sure enough, a couple weeks go by and the French show up. They have 750 men, including 250 Indians, that agreed to fight for them. They surround the fort, and fighting breaks out. The French and the Indians, they're fighting from the cover of the forest. Washington and his men are fighting from this ditch or trench around this tiny fort named Fort Necessity. Well, it's a disaster. Washington and his men are just being slaughtered. The French and the Indians, they have the cover of the forest. They only fight for one day. At the end of the day, the French commander offers Washington terms of surrender. He has no choice. If he doesn't surrender, he and his men are going to be wiped out. The document that Washington is presented with is written in French. He can't read French, but he does have a rough translation, and he understands that if he signs it, he and his men would be allowed to leave the next day with their weapons and with their wounded. So he signs it. The next morning, he is allowed to leave with his men, and they're allowed to take their wounded and any weapons they can carry. And they returned then to Virginia. But that was the first of two efforts by the English to try and drive the French out that ended in big disasters for the English. That was a disaster. That was the beginning of this war.
Okay.
Actually started by George Washington and his battle there at Fort Necessity. That was 1754.
All right.
The following year, the British government sends Edward Braddock over here, and he has a little over 2,000 men. And like Washington, he starts out here in Fort Cumberland. He marches up into western Pennsylvania, and he got to within 7 miles of Fort Duquesne. Complete disaster. He was surrounded by the French under Indian allies. Braddock was killed. 900 of his men were lost. And those who could retreated back to Virginia.
Wow.
So that was the second of 2 disasters suffered by the English that failed to win back western Pennsylvania. The English didn't do anything for 3 years. Then in 1758, the British government sends General John Forbes over here, and he lands at Philadelphia. His plans were different than Washington and Braddock. His plan was going to be to raise an army of 6,000 men, and he was going to cut a wagon road through Pennsylvania in a straight line, and he was going to build forts and encampments and redoubts along the way until he was close enough to attack Fort Duquesne. Both those things were big challenges. First of all, he's going to raise an army here in the New World of 6,000 men, and he's going to cut a wagon road through the forest of Pennsylvania, 180 miles long, with hand tools, picks and shovels, and axes. That was a big challenge.
Wow. Well,
what happened was Forbes said that he needs some place along a road that he's going to be cutting where he can have supplies stored for 6,000 troops. And he needed a place close to French territory. So he talked with some of these English traders who had been in western Pennsylvania, and he asked them for advice, and they all said the same thing. They said, well, the best place for a fort would be, a supply depot would be at Bedford. Now, they didn't call this Bedford then, they called this Raystown. There was no town here. There was a trader here once by the name of Ray. So they referred to it as Raystown. So Forbes, after much discussion, and his chief officer, Henry Bouquet, talked it over, and they agreed they would go ahead and cut a road through Pennsylvania, a wagon road, because they needed to take supplies to troops. And they would build a supply depot at a site called Raystown. Well, they started out in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where they already had a supply depot. Then they began cutting the road west. They had a small fort at Chambersburg, and then another one. They opened a wagon road to Fort Loudon. From Fort Loudon, they opened a wagon road to Fort Littleton. From Fort Littleton, they cut the road west to where Breezewood is today. When they reached Breezewood, they had to cross this river.
okay.
So they built a little fort there, and they named it Fort Juniata. because this is the Raystown branch of the Juniata River. Once that fort was up, they were still 18 miles from Raystown. They then opened a road to Raystown. They arrived here at the end of June in 1758. And if you step over here, I can tell you a little bit about the fort that was put up. They arrived here at the end of June 1758, and in 1 month, they had this fort up.
It's a beautiful diorama.
And this fort was to hold supplies for 6,000 troops that Forbes was going to raise and bring through here later. This model doesn't show everything that was in the fort. They actually had 3 big warehouses like this one. They didn't have a little one like that. They had a guardhouse, and this was to hold supplies for the 6,000 troops that Forbes would be coming through here with later on. This fort had 5 of these things called bastions. And a bastion was designed so that if an enemy got to the wall, you could still be in the fort and defend it. So there were 5 of those, and one of them had protection down to the river, so that if the fort ever came under attack, they could still bring water into the troops. Because you can live a long time without food, but you can't live long without water. The fort also had a dry moat around the western part, and the southern part here and the western part. It was a dry moat, there was no water in it, but it was about 12 feet across and about 8 feet deep.
Well, that's an obstacle to
So it was
cross.
still a barrier. Soldiers didn't live in this fort. They lived along Forbes Road out here in great big encampments. And these encampments were surrounded with temporary protection called like redoubts. And they were big. I mean, they lived in tents, and in some of these redoubts, there were 2,000 soldiers living in tents outside.
Wow.
This map over here is a good illustration of where they lived. Now here is the fort.
Okay.
And here are the redoubts where the troops lived. And this was Washington and the Virginians.
So the main fort was just really a big Walmart.
It was a big supply depot. And I can tell you more about that a little later, but if you step back over here, I can finish this off for you in
All
a
right.
short time. Are you in a big hurry?
I'm heading to Fort Ligonier. That's my,
Okay.
so we love
Well-
learning about history.
Well, like I said, in 1 month they had this fort up. The road was cut and they began to bring supplies in. And like I said, I'm leaving out the details, but just to give you an idea of how much and how many men were going to be coming here, Henry Bouquet, the chief officer for Forbes, he was the one who was really up here in the front, ordering the troops around. Forbes was back here at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But he and Bouquet were sending messages to one another every day with riders called express riders. And in one of those, just to give you a detail, when Bouquet is riding from Bedford to Forbes at Carlisle, he says in this letter, he says, tomorrow I expect 70 wagons to arrive here with supplies.
Wow.
Now, when you think of 70 wagons on a forest road, that would have stretched out maybe a mile and a half of these loaded wagons winding on a forest road, bringing supplies into Fort Bedford. Well, once the fort was up, supplies were brought in. Forbes had already been moving troops toward Bedford. Once the fort was established, George Washington and the Virginians had a different plan. They wanted those 6,000 troops from Forbes' company to come to Cumberland. And then they could follow Braddock's road. Well, the chief officer for Forbes was Henry Bouquet, and he was an excellent planner. He knew how many men could be fed off of even one beef. So he was an expert at this stuff. And he disagreed with the Virginians. He says, why do we want to go to Cumberland? He said, that would make our trip 30 miles longer. He said, why don't we just keep cutting a straight line to Fort Duquesne?
Okay.
Well, because Bouquet and Washington couldn't agree, Forbes had to make a decision. And he listened to both sides. He didn't like what the Virginians were proposing, so he told Bouquet, he says, go ahead. He says, open a road from Raystown over the mountain and continue the road to Fort Duquesne. That was a big challenge. And Washington was right. He said, you can't build a wagon road up over that mountain. He said, it's too steep. Well, fortunately, the chief engineer for Forbes was a man by the name of Rohr. And so Bouquet sent Rohr out to the base of the mountain, and he said, mark out the switchbacks so we can build a road up over it. Well, Rohr, he's an engineer. He gets out here. That's about 12 miles west of here. And he sees this mountain, and he begins looking at some of the trails. He said, we can't build a wagon road up over here. He said, this is too steep. So he began to look along the edge of the mountain, and he found a pass that went right from the bottom to the top. And when he found that, he said, we don't even need switchbacks. He says, we can cut a road right up to the top from here.
All right.
Now, that road can still be identified. I can tell you where it was located. Are you familiar at all with Route 30?
Yeah, I'm driving Route 30 quite a bit back and forth.
Okay, well, when you go 12 miles west of here, and you're at the base of the mountain, when you start up, there's one place where there's a real sharp curve. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
That was the gap. That's where Forbes Road crossed, right there to the top of the mountain. Of course, you can't see it. There's no road there anymore, but that is where it had been. Well, once they had the road cut to the top, they were now in French territory. And they only went about a half a mile where they built their first redoubt, as it was called, in French land. The remnants of that redoubt are still there today in the woods. You can still see it. It's about the size of this room right here. I have a picture of it.
All right, I'm going to pause our video.
To walk through the woods for maybe a quarter of a mile to get to it.
Okay.
I was there in the year 2000 when I took this picture.
Look at that.
And there's a monument put up in the middle of the fort. which is still there today.
Okay.
That was put up in the 1930s. When I went home and developed this picture, I realized, gee, you can't see the outline of the fort very well, like you can when you're there. There were trees growing in it, and there were stumps and brush, but the embankment is still there. It's about this high,
Okay.
and the size of this room right here. Well, since that time, it's been cleaned up. Now, I was there in 2000, and about 8 years ago, a group came in from Pittsburgh, and they bought the land that included this. So they have it cleaned up. So now you can see the outline of the fort.
Very nice.
And the monument is still up there in the middle. In fact, here's another picture of it.
And
This was called Fort Dorwit.
all right. Very nice. Well, I'm going to be running out. I got 2 minutes left of memory in my channel here.
Okay, well, I can end this for you if you
All right.
want.
And I need you to let the people know how to get to your historic site when we end it out.
Well, okay. When Forbes finally came through here, they then built forts and encampments along the top of the Alleghenies. They went down over the other side, put up a big fort there, named it Fort, eventually Ligonier. Of course, it wasn't called Ligonier at first. It was the encampment at Loyal Hannah, because there was a stream there called Loyal Hannah. Once that fort was up, Forbes comes through here with all these troops,
Okay.
up over the mountain, down over the other side. All of that took a lot of time, a lot of work, and it was now the first week of November, and Forbes and his army had just reached Ligonier. Of course, when it's November, it's wintertime. It's snowing, it's cold, but Forbes already has them cutting a road toward Fort Duquesne.
Okay.
And finally, on November the 24th, Forbes was only 12 miles from Fort Duquesne with a huge army. He has cannons, because you need cannons to attack a fort. At the fort, the French, who had scouts out and knew what Forbes had, they'd been following this cutting of this road. They depended on their Indian allies to help them. But it was wintertime, and there were some other important factors. The Indians had left and went to their families in Ohio.
Okay.
So the French were left alone at Fort Duquesne. They had maybe 500 men. They knew what Forbes had. They also knew they had no chance. So on November the 25th, they destroyed their own fort.
Okay.
Burned it to the ground, blew up gunpowder, destroyed anything they thought the English could use. And those 500 Frenchmen then traveled north to the little forts they had along the Allegheny River. The following day, Forbes moves in, takes over the ruins, and eventually builds an English fort there, and he names it Fort Pitt. He names the one at Loyal Hannah Fort Ligonier. He names the one at Racetown Fort Bedford. Those Frenchmen who withdrew north were contacted by their officers in Canada that they were to come home because they were needed up there.
All right.
They were losing the war in Canada. So this opened up all western Pennsylvania for English control. Forbes, who was ill throughout the whole campaign, didn't stay there very long. He returned to Philadelphia, and within 3 months he died.
All right.
And he's buried in Philly. Now, that is a summary. I have left out the
Well-
details. When I give presentations to...
This has been fantastic. The French Indian War, Fort Bedford, 1758. And I think I have a book or two of yours. Can you let everyone know when your fort is open, your historic site here?
Well, we plan to be open until early December, I think every day. The lady who is in charge of the gift shop, she could give you more exact information, but I think early December they closed Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and I think they're open on the weekends after that.
All right. And I guess I just want to say thank you for doing this for my viewers that follow my French Indian War adventures. And stay safe, be kind, and be courteous, everyone out there in YouTube world. Thank you.